of most liquids is the colder they are, the more gas that can dissolve into them. This is just a law of nature and is explained in a branch of chemistry called physical chemistry. But it's bullshit, so don't study it. I really hate physical chemistry. So when I open the cold can ASMR style, but when I open the warmer can ASMR styles, we have noticeably more CO2 being released. I really didn't think that that would work. This is because warm liquids can't hold on to as much gas as cold liquids. This is why a warm can of Coke will give us more gas.
What I'm getting at here is that after the Milankovitch cycles caused the Earth to warm up a little, the seas would have had to have started releasing more of the CO2 they had in them, since warmer liquids can't hold on to as much gas. This is likely to be part of the reason why we see an increase in CO2 concentrations on Earth just after we see a temperature increase. This is also quite relevant because kickstarting the end of a glacial period actually needs quite a bit more heat than what we would get from the Earth tilting an extra 2 degrees towards the sun. You see, many of the recent glacial periods have lasted around 90,000 years. Coming out of them definitely seems to require a bit of extra oomph. So what seems to happen is the Earth is warmed slightly by the Milankovitch cycle. This then causes the seas to release more CO2. This CO2 then increases the Earth's greenhouse effect, making it even warmer, which in turn causes the seas to release even more CO2. Things very quickly get warmer and warmer. This is demonstrated on this lovely graph here. This graph also shows the Earth getting warmer at the end of the last glacial period like the one we saw before. But this one is a little bit more detailed and uses every method we have available to estimate the Earth's average temperature as accurately as possible. So, here the CO2 levels of the atmosphere are listed as yellow dots, and the blue line is the Earth's average temperature. If we look closely, we can see the Earth's temperature did lead CO2 levels initially. But 90% of the Earth's warming only happened after we saw a major increase in CO2 levels, which would have been caused by the seas releasing CO2 after the initial warming of the Earth. And once this rise did happen, CO2 levels are what led the Earth's temperature index. Temperature and CO2 levels do seem to be completely related. One has almost always affected the other. So this is probably why scientists are getting their knickers in a bit of a twist. If we look back 800,000 years, we see the Earth's CO2 concentration hasn't ever really made it above 300 ppm. ppm just being a measure of concentration of CO2. But in just the last 100 years, CO2 levels have increased to over 400 ppm, meaning the concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere is now 33% higher than we've ever known it to be in the last 800,000 years. Shortly after this CO2 increase, we've also seen a temperature rise on Earth of around 1.1 Celsius that has happened 5 to 10 times faster than almost any other global temperature rise we've ever measured. This change to our temperature is happening even though we are tilting away from the sun, and the amount of solar energy hitting the Earth each year is steadily reducing. So clearly carbon is one sick son of a bitch. But where is it all coming from? And is it really the only thing that could be making the Earth warmer? There's a fancy graph on Bloomberg that does quite a colourful job of this, and that's what matters. No need for a paper bag here. This graph first shows the temperature changes we've seen on Earth since 1880. It then maps on the same graph a collection of possible causes. Here, for example, is the estimated heating and cooling effect the sun's orbit will have had on our temperature over that same period. The same has been done for the effects of volcanoes, deforestation and land use, and even the ozone layer. All of these effects combined don't seem to show any significant impact on the CO2 or temperature changes we're seeing on Earth. Based on what we know about CO2, how it has affected our temperature in the past, and a lack of any other culprits, CO2 is generally deemed the most likely cause for the increase in the Earth's temperature we've seen in the last 100 years.
In that case then, it's important to look at why the levels of CO2 in the atmosphere are increasing so much. And if you were to go with what everyone else is saying, you'd probably hear the words fossil fuels. But what are fossil fuels?
Fossil fuels are basically just plants and animals that died millions of years ago. Over time, these animals sank into the ground and eventually turned into coal and oil. This happens because coal and oil is mostly just carbon. And plants and animals too are mainly carbon. That's what people mean when they say we are carbon-based life forms. When we burn these carbon-based fuels for energy, the carbon in them reacts with oxygen, carbon dioxide is made, and the circle of life is complete. The circle! The reason a lot of people are saying burning fossil fuels is the cause of the increase of CO2 in the atmosphere is because we only really started burning them in bulk around this sort of time period, which we call the Industrial Revolution. This is when trains and factories really started burning coal and oil and gas for energy. Very shortly after this is when we started to see the increase in CO2 in the atmosphere, which we're still seeing today.
But again, how do we know it was the burning of fossil fuels that caused this increase in CO2? It could just be a coincidence. Well, there's an interesting fact about the air around us that may provide some answers.
You see, when air floats up into the sky, it actually absorbs cosmic rays from space. This eventually causes this air to contain a very small amount of carbon that is radioactive. This is called carbon-14, and all the fresh air around us contains a tiny amount. The carbon in fossil fuels, however, has been trapped away underground for millions of years. This carbon hasn't seen cosmic rays for a very long time, so contains almost no carbon-14. This also means whenever fossil fuels are burned, they produce CO2 gas that has almost no carbon-14. This graph shows us the average amounts of carbon-14 that have been present in our atmosphere since the 1880s. Over time, we've seen the levels of carbon-14 steadily reducing since the Industrial Revolution. This indicates that the atmosphere is being filled with carbon dioxide that has much lower levels of carbon-14, and the most likely source of this CO2 is from burning fossil fuels. Even more interestingly, we were only able to measure this effect until the 1950s, which is when we started detonating nuclear bombs. Because these bombs make the air around us substantially more radioactive, we can no longer really rely on this method. That's right, Quark, we really fucked up. There are also atoms that actually tell us similar things to carbon-14. These levels aren't affected by setting off nuclear bombs. So you can see here carbon-13 levels in the atmosphere have also dropped steadily in the same way carbon-14. So if all this theory is true, then it's all carbon's fault. Oh no, I'm making it worse! The main thing I've noticed about climate change is it's only ever described as this wall of bad news and serious faces and warnings that we're completely fucked unless every human on Earth goes vegan overnight, but then we're told eating more avocados is socio-politically worse than pounding a kilo of cocaine after every meal, so I don't know what to think.
Avocado toast? Cocaine toast? Why not have both?
The Earth warming a few degrees as it's currently set to do so, based on the current amount of CO2 we are producing, will bring a variety of issues to every single part of the world. There's no need to go into detail though a few examples will be the ice caps melting will likely cause widespread flooding. Large areas will get too hot to live and grow food, and forest fires will continue to get far more frequent. Stuff like that. Trying to reduce the amount of CO2 we make then is all well and good, but what do we change? Everything? Go full into the wild and eat nothing but sweet peas and starve to death with a tear of happiness in our eyes that we did the right thing?
A lot of the information and graphics coming up were provided by Dr. Simon Clark. And if you're interested in these types of videos, he makes them a lot more regularly than me. So please do have a look.
So here's a rough breakdown of where all the human-produced CO2 comes from. See, if we're going to trim things down, we must first inspect the stems. The main thing to note here is that 72% of all our CO2 emissions comes from energy. How simple. No! Energy use is such a big chunk because so much of our energy comes from burning the big bad Fs. What? Oh, fossil fuels, sorry. If we expand this, we can see that 43% of this chunk is from making electricity and the burning of fuels such as natural gas, for heating and cooking. A whole 17% is also from transport, so cars and planes and boats and such. Here is the area we must focus on first, simply as it's the biggest area. To reduce this whole delicious size, we must first simply use less fossil fuels and more renewable energy. Now this all sounds like a lot of fairy tale perfect bullshit where we power cars on princess farts and happy thoughts. But if we look into renewable energy, stuff like biofuels, solar panels and wind turbines, it's called renewable because once it's set up, it can make energy effectively forever. We take energy from places like the sun and the wind and use it to make power. We don't have to dig giant holes in the ocean or deserts to mine coal or suck up oil, and we have an endless source of low-cost energy. And that's because renewable energy is not this economic hole of depressing expense. In 2016, the fossil fuel industry was subsidized $360 billion by governments to keep versus renewable, which was given $140 billion. Renewable energy was subsidized less than half of fossil fuels, even though in America, renewables are by far the fastest growing energy resource, and solar energy is the fastest growing in the world. And because it makes economical sense, the transition is happening. In 2016, 26.5% of the world's electrical energy came from renewables. This is due in part because 146 of 197 countries have set targets to we know electricity is hit. But this is only it doesn't make only 10.3% of the energy. This is likely because renewables trendy. Only 48 countries have set targets to use increased amounts of renewable gas. The same is true of transport. Only 0.3% of our cars and planes and such use renewable energy.
As you can probably see then, a big part of this is all politics. Oh, my favourite. It's largely down to politicians and governments to choose to start building more renewable energy sources, stop subsidising fossil fuels so much, and instead start subsidising renewable energy.